Our guest today is Dr. Tim Currie. Tim is a business leader, researcher, author, and innovation expert on the topic of organizational trust, especially in remote and hybrid work environments. With more than 2 decades of experience in technology, sales, and consulting, he has personally generated more than $100 million in revenue, and the teams he has led and have combined sales output of more than $1 billion. I feel like I should be Austin Powers here, and Dr. Reed will say $1 billion.
$1 billion.
Tim is the CEO of Nova, which helps companies redesign how they build culture, trust, and performance. He also holds a doctorate from the University of Southern California Rossier School of Education, more importantly as a classmate of mine, where his dissertation was focused on trust in remote workplaces. His research and hands-on leadership experience came together in his book, Swift Trust, Mastering Relationships in the Remote Work Revolution, which explores how organizations can rebuild trust that's often lost when work moves behind screens and across time zones. Dr. Tim Currie, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Great to be here, Chris. Looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. It's going to be a lot of fun. Great to see you again, buddy.
Absolutely.
So, Tim, I'm really looking forward to discussing your book and the concept of Swift Trust, but it's impossible for me not to ask a few sales questions to someone whose biography says he personally generated more than $100 million in revenue, and the teams he's led have combined sales output again of more than $1 billion. That's a big number. What was your very first sales job?
Sure. I mean, to be clear, I've been doing it a long time, so that's a big numbers in the aggregate. I think the last role I had at a big company, I was ran an overlay team that had $1 billion target just for that year. But from a sales perspective, sales I've been involved in, sales I've helped lead, teams I've helped grow. That's kind of the aggregate. But you talk about my first sales job. So when I was 19 years old, I moved. I was in college at Michigan State, and I moved to Boston, where I was supposed to work construction with my brother-in-law. And I was there for a week, and my brother-in-law and his business partner had a falling out, and that job went away. And I had to go find work. And so this was, I'm dating myself here, but this is right before the internet was a thing, and so in Yellow Pages, I'm looking for a job. And I went to today we would call a day labor place, a temporary labor place. And it was called Tracy Labor. In the local parlance, we would pronounce it Tracy Labor. And so I walked into this place, and it, with the bulletproof glass, and the guy behind the thing, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" It's kid from the Midwest, and I said, "Well, I kind of gave him my story," and he buzzes me through. He's like, "Come on back here." He's like, "Have you ever sold anything before?" I'm like, "I don't think so." And he's like, "Well, maybe it's good luck. One of my 2 sales guys just quit yesterday, and we need a guy to sell. And it's not that hard. You open up the Yellow Pages, and you call people, and you say, we've got temporary labor, and we bus them out to where you are. We pay them at the end of the day. We cover their insurance. How hard could it be, right?" So that was my first sales job, dialing for dollars, trying to sell temporary labor. And I remember the first sale I got, it probably took me like a week, And I stood up and I said, "Hey, I got it. I got a deal. I got a guy." And I said, it's at this whatever warehouse or something up in Leo Minster. And the other sales guy looked at me. He goes, "It's Leominster, you knucklehead." He used stronger language, and I was like, "Hey, I'm from Detroit. I talk like people on the news talk. I can't help it. You guys invent sounds." And then after these, "I like this guy. He's going to be okay." So that's my first sales job. Worcester. Yeah.
Worcester.
So yeah, Worcester. So yeah, it was looking back, it was a great experience. It was my first introduction to sales. And it also, like, as a 19-year-old guy, I ended up driving the bus sometimes to drop these guys off and pick them up. So I learned Boston and, the whole thing. So it was quite the experience, but that's about the hardest sales job I've had. Like, that's, you didn't know it because you're a kid and you don't care, but it was not high glamour for sure.
Well, you say looking back there, what qualities, habits, or skills did you develop in sales that served you later in your career, especially when you shift into a leadership role?
Well, I think there's the stuff everyone talks about, right? The habits that make you successful, managing your time, managing your focus, managing your motivation. But I think being intellectually curious, at least for me in my career path, that was probably the biggest quality, to the extent I've been successful, that has driven me. Being able to recognize patterns, being able to to dig into what you're selling or what you're delivering or the organization that you're working within, to understand kind of what success looks like. And that allowed me to, I've played many different roles in my career. I've been in sales management. I've been a consultant. I've managed delivery and consulting. I've been a product manager. And I've been a director of IT, so all along the way, there was always something else. Occasionally that was a bit of a fault of mine, in that, I was always restless and, not being satisfied, or always looking for the next thing, that captured my imagination and my curiosity. Sometimes that didn't always serve me well, but to the extent I've been able to do different things and continue to evolve as both professionally and personally, I think and you can't be in research or have any academic pursuit unless you are intellectually curious. So I think that's probably the for me personally, that's one. I think the other is whether it's empathy or EQ. I mean, these things, my experience here predates, it was early in my career. I took an interest in my customer. I took an interest in them as people. I took an interest in them as, their motivation within their organizations. And people buy, to the extent they have the ability and the authority they buy from people that they like and that they trust. And that's kind of learned that very early on in my career. So
I'm going to take a sidestep here. You talked about having curiosity in academia. You and I are pretty much the same age, give or take a year. At our age, what made you go for your doctorate? You're a successful businessman. Why put yourself through that?
Yeah, you're not the first to ask me that, including my wife.
Ditto.
Yeah. Like, what you're doing? What now? Mow the lawn.
Yeah, right.
Take care of the things you're supposed. So, but in all seriousness, I've thought about this too. I probably have a better answer in retrospect than I had when I originally took the leap, as we did back in cohort 21. Great. Mm-hmm. So for more than a decade, I was part of a series of private equity backed boutique consulting companies, right? Usually focused in very disruptive technology. So at the end of the day, what that means is a collection of generally young, engineers and consultants, who are on the verge of, who found themselves mostly by just chance on the verge of something big with newer technology that the bigger players haven't come up to speed on yet, right? So growing these companies, I'm painting with a broad brush, but think about a series of companies that you grow from 50 people to 400, where you grow their revenue from 10 million to 200 million, or in some cases $1 million to 100 million. When you go through this, we were successful. All of those companies ended up getting acquired by bigger companies, which is kind of par for the course for a private equity backed company. But so you have to grow this company from what it is when it's a $10 million company versus a $30 million company versus a $70 million company. What it is a 50-person company versus 100 versus a 300 versus those are all very different companies. And not only that, but the definition of success, the direction you get, you end up doing if you're doing it right and you are in a rapidly growing company, you're doing in sales, there will be a month when you sell what you did in a year, 2 or 3 years before, right? So, and your investors are going to keep raising the bar, right? So the amount of change that happens, and for people with growth mindsets, it's an incredible opportunity. Individual contributors can have the opportunity to become managers. Managers can have the company become executives. If you're doing, and again, if you're doing it right, a lot of people make that first big leap in this environment. Whether it's the sale, first big sale, like, whatever, first big project you deliver for a big client, or first new technology. You were there when the new technology rolled out. So all that being said, there was one day I kind of looked at myself and I said, so am I good at sales? To the extent I've been good at sales. Some people might have different opinions on that. But to the extent I'm good at sales, or am I good at organizational change? Because if you think about that whole arc, doing it over and over again, there's a lot of positionality from each individual person that plays into it. What are their hopes and dreams? What are their motivations? What are they responding to? What do they want from a growth? When do they plateau, which is okay. Plateauing is okay. A lot of times that's hard to deal with when everyone's growing like this and you're like, okay, I'm kind of like right here. And who are our customers, right? So you have customers that are buying from a smaller boutique company with disruptive technology. What are their motivations? They're trying to make their career. They're trying to be change agents within their own organization. And a lot of times we're either enabling and or guiding them on that path. So I was like, I want to dig deeper into organizational change, because I think I've dug as deep as I probably can in what I would call classical sales motivation and tactics and strategies. And that's what led me to be part of our cohort and the Rossier School of Education at USC, is that they had a focus on organizational change. We can talk more about there also was an overlay with education, but organizational change was a really big focus of it. And that's what that sort of desire to dig a little deeper and maybe make that a portion of the next phase of my career in some way was what drove me to jump back in the pool, so to speak.
So instead of buying a textbook, you go and get a degree. I love it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, back on track here. Let's talk about today's workplace and your book, Swift Trust, Mastering Relationships in the Remote Work Revolution. Starting with a baseline, because different people may have different definitions or different understanding of what a hybrid workplace is. First, what is your definition of a hybrid workplace? And for that matter, what is the definition of remote work?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because I think, the world has been in certain industries, especially, we've been remote/hybrid for a long time. So I'll describe hybrid first, and I describe hybrid workplace from the traditional, what I would call the traditional definition of it. So take my own personal experiences in tech sales of some sort, whether it's software or consulting, what have you, management consulting. You have a group, you have a headquarters, or primary office, you have regional offices, you have satellite offices, but in the sales folks, the pre-sales engineers, and to some extent the consultants who might be delivering a solution or delivering consulting, they are remote. And they don't necessarily have a requirement to be in an office, because if they're doing their job, they're at the customer site, or they're at the conference, or they're out with a partner. And by and large, that was one of the indicators of success, how much you could be at the customer site, right? And also customer, be customer adjacent, be local, like to the customer, because there was a time when that's all the customers were in their offices, and the more you could be there, the better. So in that environment, that's what I would call a classical hybrid environment, where a portion of the sales force is remote, a portion of the sales force, or a portion of the workforce is remote. There was a portion of the workforce that was in office, and based on function, that's where they operated. But it was where you had offices where the company culture, the company norms, the company values grew and evolved and instantiated themselves, so that when someone who was remote came to the office, they were that whole corporate culture, norms, and values was reinforced, and they typically came to the office for a reason, right, to get something done. I think so if we take that traditional remote workplace and we now do as we did in the pandemic and say everything's remote, what you're doing is you're operating under norms, culture, established values, established processes that have been already created, but everyone is now performing their function remotely, right? That's remote work. What we have not, like what I found through my research and what I think is probably going to be a good part of our conversation today is, what does it mean when you're starting from scratch, or when you have a large amount of turnover and everyone's still remote and they're not operating, their operating system isn't clicking, right? They don't have all that institutional knowledge. They don't have the deep interpersonal relationships, both direct and indirect. They don't have all that context around who they're talking to, who does what, who's good at what. And they're operating remotely based on a set of tasks that have been given to them. And I would take that one step further. The return to office and hybrid is not the same as the hybrid that we described earlier. You have everybody who's remote for some period of time. And depending on how you implement RTO, return to office, what you might get is just a downgraded experience from your remote work. If you're going into the office and you're not getting all the things that used to be represented in hybrid, right? So I define hybrid work not as where are people working from. I define a hybrid workplace as a place where there's an experience in the office and there's an experience remote, and that you're doing organization. Organizational design evolved in the previous hybrid work model. Now it needs to be engineered, right? If that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Trust is the foundation of any sale, obviously. Did your time in sales influence your current research on Swift Trust?
It did a bit, and I'll take it back to the empathy and the EQ, kind of concept. Being intellectually curious obviously underpins the whole initiative, but I think one of the things that, skipping ahead a bit, one of the things that I've seen missing in both my research and my practical experience from a lot of organizations and how they implemented both remote work and RTO/hybrid is a lack of understanding of positionality, or maybe a lack of concern for positionality, because some people are perfectly in some of the people, it's a minority, but in some of the people that I interviewed for my research, the highest signal of trust, the highest indicator of trust is autonomy, right? And I even have some direct quotes in my dissertation, right, that said, you show your trust to me, I'm paraphrasing, but you show your trust to me by leaving me alone and trusting me to do what I've spent my career doing, and not micromanaging me. Now that's probably on the far end of the spectrum of that, right? And that person was admittedly, they said, like, I'm just not a people person. This is what I want to do, right? Doesn't mean I don't work hard. Doesn't mean I don't work all the time, but I work when and how I see fit. And that's the largest indicator of trust for me, for a certain personality type and or function, right? The vast majority of the people I talk to, of all age groups, mind you, said they love the flexibility, they love the autonomy, but they want the other things too, right? They want to know, if they were younger employees, they want mentorship. They want to build deep interpersonal relationships. They want to feel identity, that they belong to something. And with the older, more established workers, they appreciate that, as we all do as we get older, our social circles get smaller, and other priorities like family and home life and work life and autonomy take more of a prominence and value to us. However, that makes the time that we do spend working all the more important. And so what they want is, they want aspects of those things, but they want their job to be intelligently engineered so that they're getting that fulfillment with the minimum amount of sort of like time commitment, right? They don't want to peanut butter it across. They want focus, right? So that's kind of what came out of my research. from the aspect of like understanding people's positionality, what their motivation is. This goes to job design as well. So that, hey, for this role at this time, for this personality type, we may want to be as hands off and, have them be as autonomous as possible. And we want to design both a career path and an engagement strategy for that person that's a win-win. For the other end of the spectrum, which, I think most certainly for the younger workers, it's like we want them in the office, and that office experience has to provide all the things that a traditional office experience you used to provide. Their leadership needs to be there. Their team needs to be there. They don't need to be on a two-hour train ride into the city to go Zoom with someone that's working in their pajamas, right? Like that's not hybrid, and that's not giving them. That's the worst of both worlds, right? So I'm painting with a bit of a broad brush, but this is the type of understanding of positionality with empathy and EQ that really starts to underpin how do you build. We can talk more about trust and the connective tissue of how that's developed, but that's a big piece of it.
In your research, did you find anybody saying that if they were being forced to go back to work, that they were looking for other jobs that would give them more flexibility to work remotely?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would bet, and I'm sure there's a lot of studies out there, but I would bet that there are probably a third of the workforce that would immediately start looking for something else if they today are in a job they enjoy, or maybe that they don't enjoy, but a job pays the bills. They would probably immediately go look for something else. That is both a symptom and a cause, by the way, which we can get into when we talk about work design and engagement and so on. And I think there's probably a third of the workforce, certainly in the younger generations, who aren't getting fulfillment from sitting at home for 6 hours on Zoom with their camera off, that would say, yeah, I'd love to go into the office for a few days a week, as long as what was there was, if we think about how WeWork sold themselves and the environment that they tried to create, what they tried to create, and remember, this is pre-pandemic. So there were a lot of people that were working remotely pre-pandemic or working in small businesses or startups or what have you. I remember walking, WeWork was a customer of mine in a previous life. And I remember walking into one of the Manhattan WeWorks, and it might as well have been a commercial for WeWork. I mean, just filled with just like this vibrant, frenetic, vibrant, positive, cool environment, full of, seemingly, smart and stylish people interacting like in different, like you probably couldn't have paid a marketing agency to put a better picture together than when we walked in to go do a project at WeWork. They had social directors, they had beer and cold brew on tap, and all the things that guys our age, like, it was a great place to visit, but I'm not going to get on the train 2 hours a day to go have that experience. But if I was 25, I would do whatever I can to live close enough to that so that I could have that experience, right? So that is, and that was probably that was way beyond what most office environments were in, anywhere else. But if we think about that experience, that can at least be aspirational. It might not be realistic, but trying to get back to something like that when you go into the office. I'm sure there's a third of the workforce that is stuck in their apartments right now who would love that, right? At least in part, for part of the week. So the key thing is obviously organizational design to make sure that that's the experience they have.
How have companies' employees benefited from the shift to remote work, and how has the remote work been a negative factor?
I think the so there's certainly been some benefits to some companies because they can operate at a lower cost, lower operational cost, and they can attract attract talent and engage talent from anywhere, right? If their reach is good enough. And so and there are in some of whom were part of my research, there are companies absolutely thriving in a remote work environment. And perhaps thriving in a way that they wouldn't have been able to in a more traditional world that was, 20 years ago. Both the cost of standing something up, the options available to them to stand up and run a company virtually and attract talent and administer it and deliver. But those companies have, I'm going to come back to what's been lost, but the companies that are thriving and that are successful, in general, are smaller companies where the founders, the leadership know each other from the before times. So there's a level of trust that was established previously that, they can finish each other's sentences. They've been successful before. They've got a formula. And as they add people around themselves initially as like satellites, they can, that trust and that success and that vibe and culture can be both observed and absorbed. And by the nature of that, as well as how they engage their employees, they're able to propagate that sort of borrowed trust, if you will, or inherited trust. They're able to propagate that out amongst their employees to good effect. Doesn't mean they don't have, misfires on hires and bad fits and performance issues and things they got to manage through, like any company does. But there are companies that are absolutely thriving that way. I think what's been lost for younger employees, there's two big things that have been lost. One is for younger employees, all of the scaffolding that would have otherwise existed in office or a traditional hybrid environment, even a traditional hybrid workplace, where you have mentorship, you have observational learning, where you learn the norms and you see how an organization operates, what makes people successful, what behaviors are maybe frowned upon or less successful. You start to understand. When I talked earlier about having pattern recognition and taking on different roles, that probably wouldn't happen in a remote world today, right? I'd be on task. I'd be, So I think that they've lost the like corporate culture, corporate environment, and I think to a large degree the opportunities for growth and innovation. And again, I'm painting with a larger brush, but we can talk more about that. Now, that might not be what drives your company. If you are a commoditized or highly efficient company that drives on efficiencies, and like you might not care, and you might welcome. We can talk more about AI at the end of this, but you might welcome the idea that AI is going to replace processes and people run processes, because all you're doing is you're on a 10-month planning cycle and you're showing results, and that's not your gig. We've seen the unicorns struggle with this, right? Because they, I think, admittedly have lost some of their esprit de corps and their innovative culture, and they're trying to get it back. And I think it was Google that said you can't schedule innovation for 3:00 on a Tuesday, and that is absolutely true. And it also won't happen at 3:00 on a Tuesday if you're making everyone come back to the office just to show up, and they're there from 10 to 2 and they can't wait to leave, and the people they need to talk to aren't in that, like, it's not going to happen there either, right? So I think some of that scaffolding and normalcy has been lost, and the innovation and growth that came with it, certainly for the younger employees. How we get it back is a whole nother conversation, but or how we manage the remote world better. It's time for a new operating system there, right? But certainly some things have been lost.
Maybe as a follow-up to that last statement you made, more and more companies are issuing return to office orders. And that means some people are commuting an hour, 2 hours or more to and from the office again, at least 3 days a week, if not 5. What's your opinion about when return to office is a good thing and when it's not?
Well, I think return to office is a good thing if it accomplishes the goals that drive the company forward or create a differentiation or a strategic advantage. If you're in a company that needs to respond to market conditions relatively quickly, and you need employees with a growth mindset, and you need to innovate on a regular basis, if that's one of the hallmarks of your organization, then I think return to office, if done correctly, is pretty important. If you're in a commoditized business, it might be a little bit different, or your department, or, we get into work design there, right? I think that, the stark reality of, so there was a time when if you wanted to work somewhere, you did whatever you had to do and you commuted and you went there, right? If it was 2 hours, you tried to find a way to live closer, Now people have engineered their work life around their personal life and their home life. And so, whether it's the great migration, resignation, semi, whatever, it's happened. And so I think it's yet to be determined whether there's going to be a realignment back to people living closer to cities and metro areas or offices or wherever that might be. I think right now it's, if you can create there's a movie from the early 90s during the Seattle grunge, called Singles. I don't know if you remember it.
I do.
But there's a guy who's one of the main characters is trying to build a train. He's trying to convince the leadership of the city of Seattle to build a high-speed train, commuter train. And everyone keeps telling him no. People like their cars. People like their cars. People like their cars. And he was like, I'm telling you, if you give them good coffee and good music, I know they'll ride. Right. And that was like his thing. And it's kind of like, if you create the environment, you cannot just say, let's go back to the office, because whatever that office was is gone. I mean, you don't just come. I remember the first time I worked for a company called Cloud Reach, and our headquarters was in Atlanta. And I remember going back. It was like a post-apocalyptic kind of experience for me and a couple of the other folks, because I had joined the company after the shutdown. And so when things started opening up again, we went into the Atlanta office, and we found, the fridge was still plugged in, and everything in there was, like soda, like not food, but like soda cans and stuff, like 3 years old, and posters that were kind of out of date, like just the vibe or whatever. That's gone. Right. And when we did go back to that office, we downsized by, to a third of what it was, because we needed an area to have workshops and things like that. But whatever that was is kind of gone. You're not going to recreate it, and you're not going to create it, the same way just by having people come back. What you have to create is something else. You have to create a new experience that gives people more than what they had when they were sitting in their home office, either because of the face-to-face interaction, the mentorship, the human interaction, an opportunity to learn from others, an opportunity to get things done and collaborate in ways that you didn't before. We talk about communication. More than 50% of communication is body language and inflection. And it's less than 50% is the words being said. More than 50% are how they're said and how they're delivered, right? And we've been operating, if you think about that, how many times have we had to re-explain ourselves? Like, what's the cost of that, right? Either being misunderstood, or getting half the message, or being half as compelling, or half as convincing, or half as convinced. But, there's a lot there, right? So you have to recreate, I don't want to go Moneyball and say I have to recreate it in the aggregate here, but you have to find a way to recreate it, create a new experience that is more fulfilling and more successful than what might have been achieved from your home office. Doesn't mean there's not still a place for the home office. There's a lot of efficiencies to be gained there, but to recover what's been lost, that might be a new experience that looks a lot more like that WeWork office. And the energy and investment, intentional investment that went into that experience is a lot bigger than I think what most RTO plans have in store.
Well, it's interesting. You talk about how employers have to give them a better experience now to bring them back in.
They do.
And a good buddy of mine, a neighbor, works for JP Morgan. And Jamie Dimon was the first Wall Street executive to say, if you want to get paid Wall Street salaries, you need to be on Wall Street. Yeah. And right before COVID happened, they had just started breaking ground on their new headquarters on Park Avenue. And and they just finished it. And actually, my buddy's team was one of the first ones. They've been moving in over the last month. He showed me pictures. They have a world-class gym on like the 35th floor overlooking the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building. There's a restaurant there called Morgan's where you
Yeah.
have to make a reservation. The bar doesn't open until 4 o'clock. It is state of the art everything. And so he's like, okay, I want you here, but you're going to benefit from it. So it's an interesting point. I didn't think about that until you said that. And so he's setting the standard, if you will, in terms of, RTO, certainly for the
Yeah.
financial industry. And so he's certainly doing it right.
He is, and Jamie's had this conviction for a while now. Like he's never bought into any aspect of remote work. He really has. I mean, you do what you got to do during a global pandemic, fine. But he's always been very like, he's like, I'm not buying the productivity game. I'm not buying any of this. Right? Let's get back to work. That's rubbed some people the wrong way, obviously. But what I will say about it is he has conviction, and he's putting the investment forward by all accounts to deliver on that vision, and that he's like, hey, you don't have to work here, but if you work here, this is how it is, right? He goes, and we might lose some people, we might lose some talent, but in the end, I think we'll be a better company that delivers better for the industry and our customers. And he's kind of staked his future on that. I think it has. I don't know. So I think there are bigger societal impacts as well when you have, if we're going to have cities, right, which the human race always has for whatever reason. First, it was because that's where the river was, and that's where you built the factory, and that's where the jobs were, and so you had to service the people who lived in the city, right? Or it was a transportation route, and you had to protect the people who were in the transportation route. So I mean, but now we have cities we have cities, and if you're going to have them, there's, I think, seeing a cross section of life and cross section of society and engaging with them in a way. Scott Galloway has a great kind of talk track around this. I'm not sure if we've talked about this before, but he said, like, when you had the trading floor that had to happen in person, you had the Ivy Leaguers who were working at the investment desk. And you had the non-Ivy Leaguers who were, more closer to the floor and doing other sort of investment functions. And then you had, some of them were, younger relatives of the folks that were in those floors that were doing the running or the trading on the floor. But then you also had, folks from Staten Island came over on the, taking the ferry over every day that were working the floor. And then you had everyone else that that had restaurants and kiosks and whatever that are certain. And so you had all levels, if you will, or all socioeconomic, sort of statuses of society coalescing. It's not saying that, everything was unicorns and rainbows and they all got along and they didn't have their prejudices, but on a daily basis, you interacted with everyone, right? That was a representative of society in a way. And I think that that ultimately is a better world than the one that we seem to be fracturing towards, where everyone's in their own little bubble, and how we communicate and understand each other is getting compromised by the fact that we're just in our own little echo chambers all the time. So I think there's a bigger picture that certainly, when you talk about what's been lost, I think, seeing 1 million people get off the metro here in Chicago every day and, interact with everyone else along the way is, I think, ultimately a good thing for society. Well, I may have gone off script there, but
no, it's fine. And I'm trying to get to some of the highlights here that I know you want to get out there. You talk about what's good for society. You've pointed out that 1/3 of all Americans married somebody they met through the workplace, whether it's through a friend of a friend, a colleague, a coworker. Yep. What are the long-term social ramifications of remote and hybrid work? And where are the people going to meet their future mates now? Or is everyone going to be relegated to life as unmarried owner to 2 cats and a dog?
Well, I don't think that's going to happen because I think I'm on a run here quoting movies, but Malcolm from Jurassic, nature finds a way, right? But I think, look, there was a time not too long ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when 1/3 of a lot of people's life was spent in an office. sometimes more than they spent at home or sleeping, right? So it's natural that, whether it's someone, a coworker, a friend of a coworker of a friend, like that's how a lot of almost like 1/3 of all relationships and long-standing partnerships originated in the country. As remote work has become more of a thing, and digital engagement has taken over our consciousness, that's shifted to online, and that's shifted to apps. And I often get this question about trust in the remote workplace. Meyer, who's like the godfather of the definition of organizational trust, defines organizational trust as the willingness to be vulnerable and take risks and rely on someone else, the resources of someone else, when the outcome is uncertain, right? It's a very complicated way of saying, do you feel comfortable and secure and safe enough in your workplace to take risks, to innovate, to provide ideas, to take a chance? And that's the definition of organizational trust. However, and trust being, are you competent, reliable, and of good character, right? Those are generally, going back to the Greeks, to the ancient Greeks, that's the definition of trust. Your definition of trust in romantic pursuits is an entirely different motivation, and there is a risk reward quotient to all of the vulnerability, the decision to be vulnerable. There's a risk reward there that's different from the romantic perspective, right? So what I will say is, so you might be willing to risk more. You might be willing to give people more of the benefit of the doubt at times. Like, there's all sorts of things that play into that. I think that people will still find a way to find each other, right? There might be more hits and misses, but I don't think the record is all that great. Anyway. So one thing though. So let's go back to WeWork. So there was there's a woman, and I'm forgetting her name, but she was in charge of social engagement. I think corporate wide at WeWork, and I heard an interview with her one time, and they did a lot of good research because they had ready access to a lot of folks that were very engaged and provided feedback. And she said that, recognizing that the majority of people who are in long-term relationships, like 1/3 of them, not the majority, but 1/3 of them met them through the workplace. There were two things that they said. One is that there was more than half of the people surveyed, right, said that they weren't initially attracted to the person that they ended up with through that workplace or workplace adjacent relationship, but that those people revealed different parts of themselves over time. That, whether it's how they interacted with other people, where they showed a tremendous amount of capability or intelligence or a sense of humor or a particular type of sense of humor, and affinity grew over time. So in many ways, the workplace brought down that risk ratio because you were able, without committing, without making a decision, without a final determination, you were able to observe this person over time. Maybe you observe them in other relationships, or maybe, whatever. But, maybe you're in the carpool together and you learn that you like the same music. Like, this is all just human stuff, right? But when you think about online, the risk reward of online pursuits, of romantic pursuits, in the traditional workplace, you had an opportunity to kind of observe and test people out. And it brought down that risk reward ratio, if you will, around trust, even though the motivations are different, right? Which is probably why it had such a big, it's probably why it had such a big impact and a large ratio of success in that, if we call it success from that perspective.
Well, and sticking with the workplace relationships, how do we replicate hallway conversations in remote settings?
Well, one is get off Zoom and stop scheduling 8 hours, 10 hours of meetings back to back, right? So this gets back into the red herring of what I think is productivity. The hallway and workplace and water cooler conversations are, they're a bit of a trope and a meme, right? As we think back either fondly or cynically on on how people, develop good relationships are wasting a lot of time, right, in the traditional office. But if done correctly, the best way, or probably the most effective way to recreate them in a remote work world is how you implement the digital collaboration platform, like whether it's Slack or Teams or whatever. And part of that is making sure that there are non-work channels that people are freely and actively engaging in. So, whether it's the channel where we talk trash about our sports teams, or whether it's the Taylor Swift channel where people, talk about Taylor Swift, but someone like me can take my daughter to Taylor Swift concert and share the pictures and reveal, I said this in an interview just earlier this week, like I revealed an authentic part of myself. And so if you create enough, those things ideally happen organically, but they happen organically when you've properly implemented the digital collaboration platform, so it's not just a glorified email system, and also when all the leaders of the organization are engaging as well, to make it both induce whether it's is it a safe place for me to, is it going to be bad if people think I'm spending all my time here, or is it a way to be closer to leadership if I'm in there engaging as my authentic self as well, whatever people's motivation are. That's where it happens. What you would hope is that at some point people get to know each other and they pick up the phone and they develop relationships and share knowledge. But if you're going to be 100% remote organization, the ones in my research and in my experience, the people who are doing it right, there's a tremendous amount. There's almost more engagement in the non-work channels because people are online all the time and they're on their phone. Like this is like from the phone too, right? So wherever they are, it's there. That's in a 100% remote workplace. That's generally the only way I've been able to see it happen. People have virtual happy hours. But when you orchestrate events, as valuable as those are and productive as those are, when you orchestrate social events or non-work related events, like, hey, let's have a happy hour. Let's all wish, Sally a happy birthday today or whatever. I akin that to like club sports for your kids versus your kids going and playing in the backyard with their friends, right? Like one's spontaneous and organic, one's highly orchestrated, and they both have their place and they both have their benefits. But I mean, you want as much organic as possible, right? If you're trying to create that environment.
How do you see artificial intelligence influencing trust in the workplace now and say 5 years from now?
If I knew the exact answer to that question, I go back and forth between being a tech optimist and in this case, having some foreboding over where generative AI is kind of going. I think it's going to be really disruptive to the workplace. I think a lot of organizations are going to replace whoever and however they can. I think that's going to have an inordinate impact on entry level workers, and I think there will be new jobs and new industries created by this technology. But I think initially it's going to be really disruptive. Now, that being said, we talk about return to office and commuting, and I can tell you from someone who, I'm the CEO of the company I'm running right now, but I was like CRO before that and chief revenue officer. It's almost impossible to prospect today. People don't have phones, and if they have them, they're not answering them. People have email addresses, and there's all sorts of AI on the other end scraping your email out, right? And then there's armies of bots and companies sending AI generated emails out. So you kind of have like bots and filters talking to each other, and it's incredibly noisy. And so I think there might be a day in the not too distant future where companies get hyper local. And, the age old when buying becomes institutional, that's not fun. And I don't really think it has good good outcomes. As larger organizations standardize on particular preferred vendors and do RFP processes, and like, technology moves too fast. But that's a reality. The larger organizations, that's kind of a reality. But to the extent where you can still sell to somebody, you can still build relationships, build trust. Persuasion is less of a word that I would use in the sales process anymore. It's more about, sort of like trust and authenticity, and either you've got it or you don't. I foresee a world in which people don't buy anything from someone they haven't met, someone they don't know, because they're just going to turn the email off and they're going to turn the text off. I mean, I don't know why I still get 20 texts. I don't know why my cell phone carrier, my mobile phone carrier, still can't screen out all these bots that are sending me like unsolicited, whatever. But people are going to turn it off, and I think that there could be an avenue for companies to become hyperlocal, to leverage relationships, because again, we're three-dimensional folks, and we, at some point we got to stop scrolling and we got to start talking to each other. And I think that could be a potential outcome in the sales and marketing world, where, like AI is going to feed it. Now it's injection into your feed, right? It's injection into your phone. Like I clicked on something a month ago and I can't get these ads for, folks who do what I do, in the tech industry, and it's seeped now into my feed and I don't want to see it. But it's there. So, I mean, I think that could be a potential outcome as it goes. Beyond that, I think there's going to be a mad control to control the LLMs. Hopefully those become sort of like open source and decentralized. And so it becomes less about, who owns the microphone, and we'll see where that goes. But that's I think as far into the future as I can see at this point, Chris.
It's a good crystal ball to have. I appreciate that. Dr. Tim Currie, author of the insightful book, Swift Trust, Mastering Relationships in the Remote Work Revolution. Thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely, Chris. This was a lot of fun.
And fight on.
Good talking to you. Fight on.
And thank you to our audience, which includes people in more than 50 countries, for joining us for another episode of Next Steps Forward. I'm Chris Meek. For more details on upcoming shows and guests, please follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Chris Meek Public Figure, and on X, formerly known as Twitter, at @ChrisMeek_USA. We'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with another leader from the world of business, health, literature, public policy, politics, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.